Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 87 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, host and founder of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on an attic room in a large town in the Midlands of England. It is early evening in April 1956. Two young men, Jimmy and Cliff, sit in shabby armchairs reading newspapers, while a young woman, Alison, stands at an ironing board behind them, working silently through a pile of clothes. Jimmy and Alison have been married for 3 years, and Cliff not only lives with them, but works with Jimmy on a sweet stall in a market. This is not a peaceful household, however, for Jimmy is angry at just about everything. At the established social and political world that stubbornly refuses to progress, at the powers who would lead the world towards nuclear annihilation, at class privilege and cultural platitudes, but most of all at his own impotence in his forging a bigger, better life. It is everyone in his path who suffers the brunt of his anger. This is the blistering domestic diatribe that is John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, one of the landmark plays of 20th century British theatre. Since its premiere at the Royal Court Theatre in May 1956, it has been defined as marking a breakthrough in dramatic style and subject matter. Its frank depiction of a generation of disaffected youth and its working class setting inspiring a group of writers who would also be labeled angry young men. In the words of the writer Alan Sillitoe, in Look Back in Anger, John Osborne didn't just contribute to British theatre, he set off a landmine and blew most of it up. John Osborne was an unknown writer in 1956, and the Royal Court's new artistic director, George Devine, took a chance on the play because he wanted to set a new course for the theatre as a home for new radical writing. The gamble paid off. The original run became a runaway success and transferred to the West End and to Broadway the following year. Osborne won the Evening Standard Drama Award as the most promising playwright of 1956, and the play was adapted into a movie in 1959 starring Richard Burton and Mary Ure. In the nearly 80 years since, the seminal role of the volatile Jimmy Porter has attracted many renowned actors, including Michael Sheen, Kenneth Branagh, and David Tennant. And as we record this episode, the first revival in London for 25 years is on stage at the Almeida Theatre, directed by Atri Banerjee and with Billy Howell playing Jimmy. Given the iconic reputation of this play, I'm very keen to explore how well it stands up. Is Jimmy's dangerous anger still relatable or even acceptable? Well, I'm very glad to say they have not one, but two experts with me today who are well qualified to help us address these questions and more. First is Dan Rebellato, who loyal listeners will recognize is a great friend of the podcast, having joined me on our very first episode on A Doll's House way back in April 2020, for which I'm eternally grateful. And he has been forgiving enough to come back twice since to talk about Terence Rattigan's The Deep Blue Sea and Chekhov's The Seagull. Welcome back, Dan. Thanks so much for doing this again.
Thanks, Doug.
In case anyone thinks I've chosen Dan again simply because he's a soft touch and a friend, he is in fact qualified to talk about our play today because he is the author of 1956 and All That, The Making of Modern British Drama, which takes a forensic look at how Look Back in Anger emerged in its time. He's also recently chaired a fascinating panel discussion at the Almeida Theatre entitled Everything Since the Kitchen Sink, Why Revive Post-War Plays?, which is exactly the kind of question we will be considering today. As professor of contemporary theatre at Royal Holloway, University of London, Dan has published several other books on contemporary British theatre. He's also a playwright in his own right, having written at least 19 stage plays and numerous radio plays, including most recently an adaptation of Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend, which as it happens airs on BBC Radio 4 this very weekend. My second guest is the director of the current revival of Look Back in Anger at the Almeida here in London, Atri Banerjee. Welcome, Atri. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this fascinating and challenging play.
Thanks so much for having me.
Atri has previously been a member of the Almeida's resident director scheme, where he directed Name, Place, Animal, Thing as part of 6 Artists in Search of a Play. He's also a recipient of the 2022 to 24 Peter Hall Bursary at the National Theatre, creative associate at the Gate Theatre, and was previously trainee director at the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester. His other directing credits include Julius Caesar for the RSC, The Glass Menagerie at the Royal Exchange and at the Rose Theatre in Kingston and on UK tour, and Hobson's Choice at the Royal Exchange, for which he won the Stage Debut Award for Best Director. Atri is also a trustee of the Regional Theatre Young Directors Scheme. Okay, Dan, if I could start with you. Could you tell us a bit about who John Osborne was and where this play came from in his life story?
Well, John Osborne has a mercurial upbringing. He has a strange, we might talk about class, I think. He has quite a difficult class placement. He probably, we would say, grew up in a lower middle class family. But his father, very relevant for this play, died when he was 10. And as a result, I think, of the life insurance, was able to be sent to a boarding school, a private boarding school, from which he was expelled by his own account for punching the headmaster, though other people think that might be slightly overstating it and that he may have just got into a fight with other kids. Anyway, so he's a school dropout who was briefly a journalist, became a stage manager for a while, and drifted from there into becoming a jobbing actor, really, and spent sort of 5 years or so, usually in regional repertory companies and touring. He started writing plays, and so actually Look Back in Anger is the 4th play that he wrote, and the first 2 got put on in Huddersfield and Harrogate, I think it is, so not with a national profile, but he had a couple of plays on, and there was a 3rd play that was then put on after Look Back in Anger. So he's got theatrical experience, lots of theatrical experience as an actor, and he's actually got some writing experience. But of course, when Look Back in Anger appeared, this seemed to be a bolt from the blue because nobody really had heard of John Osborne. I suppose the other thing that's just worth saying is that he was married at this point to what we have to say is his first wife, Pamela Lane. And they lived together for a while in Derby, I think in a cramped attic flat, where they sort of bickered with each other and called each other bear and squirrel and things like that. So there is clearly, I'm not going to say an autobiographical side to this play, but certainly he's drawing on things that he knew very well.
Yeah, so it is, I think, based on his first marriage to Pamela Lane, another actress, and that they lived together, as you say. And it sounds like, I mean, judging by the play, not very happily. And I'm not sure, Audrey, were they separated at the time? Do you know that he wrote this or still together?
I think they had separated by this point, by the 8th of May, 1956. So when she came to see it, she famously said, "Oh no, not the ironing boards," as it appeared at the beginning of the play.
Okay. So it was as autobiographical as that?
Well, I mean, certainly when she would talk about the play herself, I think she would suggest that there had been autobiographical influence in it, to the extent that she would famously later on audition to play Alison in a production of Look Back in Anger, and she didn't get the part, which I think is kind of an astonishing story to be not cast as someone who is yourself, kind of triggering probably some sort of major identity crisis.
That's one of the best footnotes we've ever had on this podcast, I think.
I think for me, the autobiographical impulse is just very interesting. Obviously, Osborne's own middle name was James, so Jimmy Porter.
Another great footnote.
Yeah. It's always an interesting thing being like, how much do you draw from the life of an artist when you're making a piece of work? And I think particularly when you're reviving a classic play, you're always looking for what those original impulses might have been in the writing. So I think that the way that I like to treat them is as clues, really, rather than as sort of gospel, because I don't think he was necessarily slavishly reinterpreting his own life. He was also taking clues from his own life.
I think, judging from the play, it had been quite a volatile relationship, and that, in fact, I read somewhere that she had been having an affair, so that may have been part of what was going wrong with that marriage at that point. Apparently, I also read that he wrote Look Back in Anger in 17 days. in a deck chair on Morecambe Pier while he was performing in a repertory theatre. And it struck me that 17 days, it made me white hot anger he was writing in. And it took him only 17 days because it was very fresh in his mind. But I wondered, is the play some sort of tortured cry of pain or hate for her, or even revenge? Or is it also mixed up with maybe he still wanted the marriage to work or to want her back? I mean, I believe they continued to have a relationship for the rest of his life, even while he married 4 more times.
Yeah, I mean, again, the 17 days thing is fascinating. And I don't think we can underestimate sort of, obviously, as Dan has said, it was his 4th play, but this is the work of a young man. He was in his mid-20s, 25, 26, when he wrote it. And embarrassingly, obviously, I'd heard of the play and I knew its reputation, but I didn't know it very well before Rupert Gould, who's the artistic director of the Almeida, first suggested it to me. But I think that was one of the things that really drew me to it. The quality, which is, there's a lack of polish to the dramaturgy, to the structure of it. There's a real pizzazz and panache, and I think the language and the writing leaps off the page. But there are bits, like it's quite long, for example. The structural parallelisms can maybe feel a little bit contrived. The way that he writes the women, I would suggest, is maybe not necessarily as articulate as the way that he writes Jimmy Porter. I don't think those are flaws per se, so much as just things to grapple with when you're trying to produce something.
But you're right, it does have that sense of an outburst, doesn't it? Unedited virtually.
Exactly. A cri de coeur. But the thing you've alluded to with the relationship with Pamela Lane that existed right until the end of their lives, and their letters are collected in this amazing book called Dearest Squirrel. I was very keen, and I think we as a company were very keen to quote unquote amplify Alison's voice in the production as much as we could, because it felt to me that she was as much a protagonist as Jimmy Porter is in that play. She's actually on stage probably for longer than Jimmy is. Obviously, Jimmy's got more words, but she is in more consecutive scenes than Jimmy is. And I think delving into that Osborne-Lane relationship felt very important to me as we were making it.
That's fascinating. You're right. We'll come to talk about the women in some detail. But it's interesting. I did pick up in those letters you talked about. In one of the letters, he describes the play to her, this is 30 years later, as a pretty anguished love letter to her. It's pretty anguished. I think we'd have to agree. Can we talk, Dan, a bit about the reception to the play? It has this mythical reputation for being this bombshell that exploded in the genteel world of the British theatre in 1956. Was that how it was received by the critics and audiences at its opening? Was there notable outrage or acclaim?
So the legend is that it was absolutely panned by everyone except Kenneth Tynan. That's not quite true. It actually got quite respectful reviews, but absolutely not outstanding reviews until the Sunday in the Observer, when Kenneth Tynan wrote this famous review that concludes, "I could not love anyone who did not wish to see Look Back in Anger," which of course is a typically self-advertising Kenneth Tynan type line. But that was the thing that absolutely propelled it, because what he situates in that review is this play as the voice of a generation. He picks up on Somerset Maugham's comment about sort of state-educated, welfare state-type people as scum. And Tynan says, yep, and these people are scum a mile wide. So it's a very confrontational review, and it's a brilliant review, and just the kind of review you want to get a new generation into the theatre, and that seemed to work. So yeah, it has this reputation of, as you say, this bomb exploding in the genteel world. Clearly, it did make an absolutely enormous impact. All I would just say is that characterization of the previous theatre as purely decorous and genteel, of course, is completely false, and there's lots of wonderful work that is obscured by that. But absolutely, Look Back in Anger, there is no more suddenly influential play in Britain of the last 100 years. I mean, it really inspires a generation of writers. In fact, a couple of generations of writers.
And I know in your book, 1956, and all that you suggest that it wasn't like all the work that went on previously was worthless by comparison. We think about Ratkin and Coward being dismissed for being superficial drawing room comedy or whatever. But of course, we know better that there's all sorts of repressed emotion, sexuality, even brutality going on in those plays. I was intrigued to read, Atri, in the program for the production that the director, Tony Richardson, talked to Osborne after the first reviews came out, because some of them were a bit negative, I think. One of them called the one-room flat in the Midlands unspeakably dirty and squalid, and didn't really go with this social realism. Osborne was a bit dismayed by this reaction.
Yes, totally. And Tony Richardson took him for a coffee and said, well, what did you expect? You didn't expect them to like it, did you? I mean, I'm paraphrasing there, but I sort of wish I had the capacity to say that to a writer.
Well, I think his implication is it's a deliberate bomb, isn't it?
Yeah, but for me, that sort of story evokes one of the paradoxes that I find with Osborne and with Jimmy Porter as well. This railing against the establishment, railing against the prevailing structures, but also some sort of desperate need to be accepted as well. Like the question of what is Jimmy angry about? And we referenced Coward. I went to the Noel Coward archives as part of my research for this, and there's letters where Coward is writing about Look Back in Anger, and he says, what is this young man so angry about? Which was the big questions that we had in the process.
Well, we definitely want to ask that question.
I'll hold on to it for now.
We talk about the anger, and I mentioned the angry young men. Dan, perhaps you could give us some more historical context. Could you tell us who the angry young men were and where that label came from? What's that all about?
Well, the label absolutely came from John Osborne and the Royal Court Theatre, the Royal Court Theatre's publicist. By John Osborne's own account, which I have to say, John Osborne's own account is rarely something you should really rely on. But he says that the Royal Court's publicist really had no idea how to publicise this very different type of play, and sort of said in a rather disdainful way, well, I suppose you're a sort of angry young man, aren't you? And that stuck, and that's how they publicised it. And a lot of other writers started to get drawn into that, including Kingsley Amis, John Wayne, Stan Barstow, Alan Sillitoe, and so on, which were a lot of writers who emerged in the middle of the 1950s, very often writing very ordinary characters, not necessarily always working class, but not titled characters, not heroic characters, very often with a cynical or at least unromantic attitude to sex and work, and often placed in urban situations, urban landscapes, and so on. And that generation lasted, I suppose, into the mid-60s, that you would say that that became a real centre of British culture, including a lot of movies. Some of this first wave of plays and novels were quite quickly turned into films. And also, of course, I think the other, probably the most lasting impact was Coronation Street. Coronation Street was absolutely invented as an attempt to find a long-running form of the angry young man's vision of society.
But the epithet angry, I mean, well, I guess we could dive into this. What were they angry at? There's a disillusionment with traditional British society, I suppose.
What were they angry about, of course, is the question that launched 1,000 PhDs, including mine.
Okay, I was going to ask you both about the title then, because there are a couple things. There's anger and there's looking back. And I presume primarily we're talking about Jimmy and what is he angry about, but also why is he looking back? At age 25, you might expect he'd be more concerned about the present and the future. So let's talk a bit about what this title signifies, and it includes what Jimmy might be angry about. So, Atri, you wanted to talk about what Jimmy's angry about.
What makes Jimmy angry, yeah. The alternative titles that Osborne had for the play were things like My Blood is a Mile High or Man in a Rage. Jimmy Porter says that at one point, I'm going to write a book about all of us, and it's be written in fire and blood is what he says. But then I think the fact that he changed to Look Back in Anger, I mean, the 8th of May 1956 was the day that the play premiered at the Royal Court. It's also the day that his father was either born or died. So for me, the thing of looking back felt really important, as much as the anger bit of it. And Jimmy has this famous monologue in the middle point of the show where he talks about watching his father die after his father came back from the Spanish Civil War. And he says, I learned at a young age what it was to be angry and helpless. But then delving a bit deeper into the text, actually many characters talk about looking back. Alison says, I keep looking back as far as I can remember, and I can't remember what it feels like to be young, to be really young. And there's a point where she references Jimmy saying a similar thing, and then the colonel, who's Alison's father, when he comes in the second act of the play, he describes the life in India as well. And so there's this sort of dramaturgy of memory, which is going on throughout the piece, and actually inherited trauma, I guess. It could expand out to that. My point with all that is to suggest that I think these characters are all dealing with anger that has been inherited in some shape or form. And it's not just the anger they're feeling in the present moment, but it's years and years of disillusionment, dissatisfaction, the trauma of the two world wars, obviously. And what we inherit from our parents is something that I just think is a really fascinating theme in this play.
Yeah. So, Dan, you mentioned at the very top Osborne's father. So, is there an element here you think about him coming to terms with or mourning his father?
Or not coming to terms with the mourning of his father. What I think is interesting about this question about what's he angry about is how difficult it is to answer that, because you would think that with the reputation of this play, you would say, well, this is very clear what Jimmy Porter's angry about. But it isn't. His targets, such as they are very scattershot, and they mix public political things and very personal things. You know, Alison is clearly viciously the target of his anger for the first half of the play. And then he will also make comments about, evangelists and politicians and, the church bells and stuff like that. And I wonder whether actually, in a way, what we're being encouraged to think about really is not what he's angry about, but the very fact that he's angry is what's important about the play and what Jimmy Porter is experiencing and feeling. And much of what he seems to be saying to Alison in particular is, I just want you to feel as intensely as I feel. And it doesn't really matter what you feel about. I just want that feeling. And that is a personal thing. That maybe Jimmy Porter's experience of his father's death has given him this great wellspring of intense feeling that has no outlet. But it's also, a sense of the etiquette and manners of the establishment are encouraging a public code of conduct that is understated, subtextual, to use the cliche, stiff upper lip and so on. And really what we get from this play is the burning sense of deep personal feeling.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, both public and personal, because it is scattergun. He takes a shot at all sorts of things in the world around him, about class, the newspapers, the church, women, anything. There was a line I keep coming back to, which I keep attributing to James Joyce, and I hope I'm correct, but where he said that all anger is anger with yourself. And this seems to apply as to where this might come from. And it's just, as you say, it's incoherent anger at times, and the point is just the anger itself. That there's also a lack of anything to believe in is partly suggested. He can't find the definitive target. It's an expression of his internal state in some way. There's an interesting comment in Osborne's introductory stage directions about Jimmy and his anger. He says to be as vehement as he is to be almost non-committal, almost like it's unproductive and not specific. And I also read later he wrote a sequel, weirdly, to Look Back in Anger in 1993 called Deja Vu, in which a middle-aged Jimmy says that anger wasn't actually about anything again. It is mourning the unknown, the loss of what went before without you. It's the love another time, but not this, might have sprung on you. I'm not sure what he's missing. He doesn't possibly know what he's missing, but he's missing something and that no longer exists. And this is this weird thing. While he's looking back, isn't it, Atri? He's somehow missing something that happened in the past that he likes, even though he's scathing about the past as well. There's some paradox going on in that, I think.
Yeah, I think it's the great paradox of the character, really. And the passage towards the end where he talks about there are no good, brave causes left anymore. And he says, if the Big Bang does come, we might as well all step in front of a bus. That's immediately preceded by, I seem to spend my life saying goodbye. So it's that constant clash between massive vulnerability and massive aggression, I think, feels really crucial to his character. And I think the thing about anger is anger in of itself, I don't think is a negative emotion. I think anger can be a very constructive force. And you think of every single political movement that's ever happened has always been fueled by some level of anger or at injustice. And I do think Jimmy feels at least that he has that anger within him. but it's turned and contorted and turned inwards in a way that it can only come out in a way that feels vicious, which can be quite destructive, really.
Yeah, well, it's also turned on others, isn't it, of course?
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you about the form of the play because that's partly what gained it its notoriety is something called kitchen sink drama was also associated with these angry young men and the plays that followed it, and this is emblematic of it. And I wondered what was meant by that kitchen sink drama. Dan?
Well, I think it relates to the quote from the critic that you mentioned before that talks about this shabby and squalid flat that the play is set in. I think kitchen sink drama just really referred to a very, very ordinary part of the home that you didn't normally see, because without wanting to buy too much into the decorous and genteel version of the West End before it, nonetheless, there would have been a lot of plays in the West End set in country houses and, castles and this sort of thing.
Drawing rooms.
Yeah, and drawing rooms that you wouldn't see a kitchen sink, but actually you see that sort of thing. You see an ironing board. That's the first thing you see when the curtain goes up. So I think that in a certain way, there's a slightly disdainful quality to this labelling of these plays as kitchen sink dramas. Noel Coward once wrote, "Why are we making such a cult of squalor?" he said. And what he means by that is just, why are we looking at these sort of shabby things? Why aren't we seeing the more beautiful sides of life? And so I suppose that's really what they mean by kitchen sink drama.
It's fascinating you said Atri earlier about referring to Pamela Lane talking about, oh no, the ironing board. But I also wanted to ask you, Atri, the implication that this is social realism, I guess. So is this play a fully naturalistic work? I imagine the original production, as we've just been touching on, and many since, certainly including the film, give us the detailed grimness of the setting, the one room of their rented flat. But your production doesn't do that. It doesn't present us with detailed social realism in that sense. Can you describe some of the design you employed and why you interpreted the play that way and what you think about how much it is a naturalistic work?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think one of the things that I found quite interesting about the idea of the kitchen sink drama was that it also was a movement in visual art as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but the paintings by John Bradby, which in 1954 were alluded to as kitchen sink paintings, they're quite expressionist. They're not naturalistic in detail. They're lurid colors, abstract figures. And one of our key design references for this production was actually the work of Francis Bacon.
Wow.
I do think the play itself is naturalistic in form, but I do think there's a quality in it which feels quite operatic as well. And I think for me, what felt really exciting was this idea of tragedy, really. And I mean tragedy in the Greek classical sense of the word, that there is a huge amount of catharsis at the end of the play, and the play evokes pity and suffering, which is obviously what Aristotle says should be in any tragedy. And I was interested in, is there a more elemental version of this that sort of strips away some of the period detail? We haven't completely stripped it away. I mean, there's still in sort of 50s referencing clothing. There is still the ironing board. We haven't lost that. There is so much language in the play about saints and devils and satanic, and it feels almost like Alison and Jimmy are locked in this sort of angel-devil struggle, Manichaean struggle throughout the play. And there's also loads of references to war, battlefields, no man's land, trenches. And I wanted to try and unlock some of the more symbolist readings of what the text might offer. I don't think it's the first production to do it. There was a production in Bath, which I think was directed by Peter Nichol, which really lent into the memory soundscape of the play. But it sort of felt like, is there a way of making people look at this text again?
Just to come in on that, I think just two things. One thing I thought was very interesting about this production was that, weirdly, it went back to the first staging, because the first staging of Look Back in Anger was performed by a repertory company who were doing other shows. And also the first production had a permanent surround. They had a permanent built, designed set at the Royal Court Theatre, in which the set by Alan Tagg for Look Back in Anger sat. So the audience who watched Look Back in Anger and had seen anything else or would see the next shows at the Royal Court would have been aware that there was a sort of continuous design, very like the way that the Almeida works, where you're always seeing those brick walls. But also, I think, in terms of the naturalism of the play, I think it's really interesting that Audrey described it as operatic, because, as you probably know, Osborne referred to Jimmy's speeches as arias. And I think that is where, as Audrey said, it's a naturalistic play, but there's something about the space given to Jimmy's speeches that cannot help but break the fourth wall. There is a sort of sense that he is addressing the audience. He's addressing perhaps the world rather than just the people in the room. And that, I think, is also why some of the early critics took great offence at it, because they knew they were being directly addressed. It wasn't just Alison, it was the people in the audience.
That's fantastic. It ties in with, I think Michael Billington talks about the freewheeling language as the play's distinctive innovation. And the language, I was going to say, Atri, as well, is that you're right, it's very heightened at times, isn't it? It's furious and rhetorical, Dan. In a way, it's the speechifying that Jimmy makes, using literary references and quite strange imagery at times. There's the crazy stuff with the squirrels and the bears, which is quite odd. And then there's this music hall routine they do as well. So there's language that comes from that. And some of the sexual imagery language is slightly bizarre. So it's fascinating in that respect. Now, we've talked for some time now about this play without giving away all that much about what actually goes on. I usually like to give listeners who don't know the play and may not get a chance to go and see your production, Atri, a brief summary of what happens. Now, I realize that this might mean spoilers. So if you still want to go and see the production, which I highly recommend, you can turn off now and come back later. But otherwise, we're going to plow on. And I wonder, Dan, whether you would just kick us off with the very briefest synopsis of what actually happens, who these characters are.
Yes, well, as you say, the play is set in a rented flat in the Midlands where Jimmy Porter lives with his wife, Alison, and their friend, Cliff. And Jimmy is, as we've said, this frustrated, angry, passionate man who despises his wife for her polite manners and what he sees as her lack of vitality, her passivity, her lack of feeling, and so on. But Alison is at a crossroads because she is pregnant and she now has a decision to make about whether she can actually bear Jimmy's cruel behaviour any longer. And the arrival of Alison's friend Helen precipitates a break in the marriage because she arranges for Alison's father. Alison's parents despise Jimmy, and she arranges for Alison's father to come and bring her back to the family home. But then, sensationally, Jimmy and Helen begin an affair. And then in the final act, Alison returns, and she's lost the child. And at the end of the play, she and Jimmy uneasily reconcile, somehow bonded by their shared experience of loss. Will that do?
That's fantastic. Well done. Thank you. I mean, dominant in terms of words and noise is Jimmy. And what we really witness is the anger, but there's also, isn't there, a lot of cruelty? He's just terrible to Alison, and then again to Helena, her friend, to Cliff even, who's supposedly his best friend. And he lashes out at Alison's family as well. And it's really relentless and vicious.
Absolutely. I mean, it is vicious, and I think it's important to name it for what it is. It's abuse. I mean, I think it's certainly in the relationship with Alison, it constitutes abuse, I think. And that is really, I think, one of the things that I really learned over the course of the process, certainly listening to my female colleagues, how sharp Jimmy is, particularly towards the women. Yes, of course, he's abusive towards Cliff and he's abusive towards the whole world. But certainly in the context of patriarchy and misogyny and gender-based violence that we live in at this present time, it would feel remiss to ignore the fact that we have framed the relationship between Jimmy and Alison as certainly an emotionally abusive relationship, if not a physically abusive one. But I don't think that means that you write off the character. I think you can still try and understand why someone might abuse without apologizing for it. And I do think that is what theatre is good at. And I think when I'm talking about tragedy as well, these really dark, complex emotions that people go through, not just for Jimmy and why he feels the need to abuse, but also why Alison stays and why she returns.
Yeah, we have to come back to the Alison question, definitely, but you're absolutely right. The cruelty is extraordinary. You mentioned, Dan, that Alison is pregnant, and she hasn't told Jimmy this, but we learn this, and then only minutes after she has told Cliff that she's pregnant, Jimmy actually curses her, where he says, if you could have a child and it would die, he wants that to happen to her. Please, if I could only watch you face that. I mean, it's just horrific. And it's interesting that some of the reviews, and I was going to ask you both about this, As a portrait of toxic masculinity, he's pretty scary and it's deeply unpleasant. And some reviews have basically said, flat out, he's a misogynist, a bully, pure and simple. We can have no sympathy with him. In fact, no point in watching him anymore. This is just tiresome and unacceptable. So, can we feel any kind of sympathy for him?
I mean, I suppose the first thing I'd want to say is an obvious kind of protocol for how you deal with any play, which is that the fact that the central character of a play is a misogynist does not necessarily make the play misogynistic, in the same way that the fact that Macbeth is a murderer does not mean that Macbeth is murderous as a play. And so I think I really liked what Atri said earlier about that we should think of the relationship between the autobiographical elements in this play as about using clues. Because I think a playwright as good as John Osborne, and he's a very, very, very good playwright, is someone who is capable of exposing in a very brutal way how misogyny works. If it's a portrait of himself, it's a warts and all portrait of himself that is pitiless. And I think he gives us every reason to understand how the emotional abuse, the coercive control, the gaslighting, all the stuff that we're now very much more conscious of, he exposes all of that rather brilliantly. My experience of Look Back in Anger is not that we feel, oh, but he's such a lovely guy. We are seeing a horrible guy. Yes, he has lots of pain himself as well. And of course, there is complexity in our relationship to it, which is why I don't like that kind of response that says he's a misogynist pure and simple, because there's nothing pure and simple about this play at all. It's a really complicated, difficult play that I think gives us an opportunity to understand some of the worst aspects of male behaviour, but also actually what happens when relationships break down in a horrible way. Because, you know, lots of people have been in those relationships. There's that point where he's knocked over the ironing board and burnt Alison's arm. And he says, this is not his words, but he says, why can't I bring myself to be sympathetic or to apologise? And it's one of those situations where, you know, those built up resentments in a relationship means that actually both people are sort of denying the basic connection that brought them together in the first place.
Yeah, I think you're spot on about the difference between characters behaving in loathsome ways and the play or the playwright condoning those. And now people object to even giving voice to this language, of course, and it can be hard to listen to, but one cannot deny the truth in its time, or even that it's still people who behave or think in this way. And I think one of the points of the play, as now, is to disturb audiences, to make us consider such attitudes and behavior and where they come from. And on that point, Atri, where they come from, it is complicated in Jimmy's case. You know, it's cri de coeur, you said earlier, although it takes it out in his cruelty to others. He's trapped, he's bored, he's frustrated, he's possibly depressed. You know, his mental health is not stable. These are not necessarily excuses, but there is also suggestions of vulnerability, aren't there, at times in intimate moments with Alison, for example?
Your question about, like, do we have sympathy for him or empathy for him? I think as a theatre director and as a group of actors, you have to hold everyone empathetically. And I think that's one of the great joys of making a show, that you're able to look at these very difficult behaviors and try and understand it in a safe way. I don't for a moment justify his behavior or excuse his behavior, but I think I have to try and understand where it comes from. And for me, it is a deep brokenness and a deep vulnerability. And I do think that thing what Dan was saying, I think he writes Alison very eloquently. He writes Alison's experience of being a survivor of that sort of relationship very eloquently. And I think whether or not the relationship someone is in is abusive in the world, in the audience coming to see it, we've all experienced some level of a difficult relationship, or a relationship people might describe as toxic. And I think that's really important to represent authentically and honestly in that complexity and in its difficulty. I think the thing for me that felt really important doing this production today, and in a way I'm quite gratified by the responses being quite divided, because I thought, well, if we're doing this play today, it has to feel as shocking as it must have done in 1956. And I do think that misogyny and that abuse and presenting it clear-sightedly does feel very shocking. The shock is different, isn't it? It's a different thing that we're drawing on. Though I should say that in the reviews in the 50s as well, there were certainly reviews that identified this misogyny and abuse as part of the structure of it. I don't think it's as simple to say as in the 50s they didn't think about these things, because of course they did.
Interesting. We touch on Alison. Let's talk about her for a little bit. Osborne described her as the most elusive personality in the mix in his stage directions. There are several questions one has about why she is with Jimmy at each stage of the play in her life. One of the first important facts, of course, about Alison is she comes from a different social caste from Jimmy, and she married him very much against her parents' wishes. So the first question I have is, why did she marry Jimmy?
I think one reason is extremely simple. I think she really falls in love with him. They're in their early 20s. She describes the romance of him arriving at this party on a bicycle, and she talks about everything about him seemed to burn, like he's shining. And obviously there's an element of rebellion against her family. There's an element of escape, and he's the sort of James Dean rebel without a cause kind of figure when she first meets him. But I think she really, really falls in love with him. And then as the play goes on and as his behavior gets more coercive and more toxic, I think it's a very common pattern that I think you always cling on to the good times. And I feel like she probably thinks that she can fix him or she can change him, or at some point but then at the same time, she's also implicated in this struggle. She says something along the lines of, I could give him what he wants, but I don't because I know it'll hurt him. And by no means am I suggesting that is equivalent to Jimmy's abuse of her. But she's in a dynamic as well, which becomes codependent, to use quite modern speech. And they're trapped together in that, I think. But I think at the heart of it is love.
Yeah, and there's obviously a strong sexual connection, I think. She says, I've never really wanted anyone else. And especially, as you say, the way she describes first meeting him, there's a magnetism to him that seems irresistible. And we'll talk about Helena as well, because that seems to happen with her too. And then staying with him, I mean, why does she stay in this relationship? And when at the very end, spoiler alert, she returns. Dan, what do you think about her motivations there?
Well, first of all, I'm sure we all know people who are attracted to people who aren't good for them. It's not unheard of. And of course, there is the question of, very often happens, why do certain women not feel able to leave coercive relationships? Well, because they're coercive. I think the other side of that, though, I'd say, and this is picking up on what Atri said, that really interesting thing, she actually knows ways to hurt him back, is that I think it would be a mistake just to see her as a victim. I mean, she is a victim of his behaviour, but there are ways in which I think she actually gives, at least to some extent, as good as she gets. There's a really interesting thing that Osborne once said, that his anger is matched by the thump of her iron. And I remember when I first read that, I thought, oh, really? Ironing is her response. But actually, theatrically, there's something really interesting about his arias, the way they rise and fall. And when she doesn't respond to them, we're left with that kind of thump of the iron. And it's a bit like in a radio play, if you want to make a room sound silent, you have a ticking clock. You know what I mean? You put a bit of noise in a room for silence. And what it means is it's a sort of passive-aggressive thing, going, I'm not going to rise to your aggression, which I know is going to be the most annoying thing to you. And that rhythm of the iron does emphasize the fact that he is in a state of perpetual failure in the play, which I think is interesting. Just like Audrey, I'm absolutely not trying to say that they are sort of equally matched in their cruelty. But she's not just a passive victim in this play. This is about a battle between two people, I think.
Definitely. And I wrote down somewhere that she uses silence as a weapon because she doesn't respond. And she says at one point, I pretended not to be listening because I knew that would hurt him, as a strategy in this battle. But she becomes worn down, doesn't she? I don't think I can take much more. I'm so tired. I dread him coming into the room. Inevitably, she is worn down. So she leaves. And she unfortunately has a miscarriage, and some months go by, but she returns and she stays, it would appear. Why would she come back, and why would she stay, Autry?
Again, a $1 million question, a $64 one, as Alison puts it. Look, I mean, I think the thing is, I did a play earlier this year which was about domestic violence, and we met lots of survivors of domestic violence as part of that. So that was really informing my take on this play. And I think what Dan is saying is really right. I think it's why people often use the word survivor rather than victim today when we talk about these relationships, because I think those defenses and those resources to push back have a strength about them and have a vitality to them, which is important to acknowledge. I think the reason she comes back is because once she loses the baby, I think well, there's this thing of she claims she gains this knowledge of suffering. I'm in the dirt, I'm in the mud, I'm groveling, I'm crawling. And I think she comes back because it's all she's ever known, really. And the magnetic pull of that space feels like she describes almost like getting on the train and not being aware that she was getting on the train until she's back in the Midlands town. So I don't know if it's particularly like she has much agency over that particular decision to come back. And I think the ending of the play is horrible and brutal, but I'd like to think that there's a glimmer of hope in it.
Ooh, okay.
In terms of, I think Jimmy does possibly learn something about Alison in that moment, that she has experienced a form of suffering that he will never experience. I don't think I'm answering your question very well, because I don't think there is one answer.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one to answer. She does love him. Let's go back to your first answer, I think, which is hard to leave behind. But let's come back to that. I wanted to talk a bit about Helena and what happens to her, because Dan, you mentioned in the plot summary, it's fascinating the journey that goes on in this character. She is from the same class as Alison, and this particularly winds Jimmy up, and they go at it hammer and tongs. And actually, she seems to stand up to him and supports Alison, and in fact, of course, encourages Alison to leave. But the moment at the end of this act where she turns and ends up kissing Jimmy and going to bed with him is fantastically shocking. What is going on there? Where does this come from in Helena?
Well, there are two ways of answering that. I mean, one is that it's a really great curtain. And in a way, I think that's serious because John Osborne has been acting in the kind of plays that need strong curtains to bring the audience back from the second interval. And he's just got a real instinct for that. And it's a brilliant moment. Whatever it means and however we understand it, it's an amazing coup de théâtre. It's a wonderful moment. I think the second thing, obviously, we can think about why this has taken place. I mean, it might just be that Helena sees in Jimmy exactly what Alison saw in Jimmy when he turned up to the party. It may be that, as we know, sometimes people are at their most bantery and hostile with people they secretly fancy. There are those sorts of possibilities. I'd be really interested to know, actually, Atri, how did you guys decide her motivation?
It was a challenging bit of the play to try and understand, I think, because I think, again, we're talking about the contemporary lens and contemporary gender politics, I guess. I think there is another version of Helena, which I don't think we've done in our production, where she is a bit more manipulative, I would say. There definitely have been versions where she really fancies Jimmy from the beginning, and it's almost like she's pushing Alison out of the picture. That didn't feel right to us as we were making it. But having made that choice where she's sort of genuinely concerned about Alison and genuinely wants to get her out, you have to fight him or he will kill you, is what she says. It then meant that the corner where she slaps him and kisses him, more complicated to achieve. So we don't quite do it in the same way in our production. But our way of sort of rationalizing it was, he has said to her, if you slap me, I will be violent back towards you. I don't think that Jimmy actually would have necessarily been violent towards her. But however, that's not what Helena thinks or Helena knows. So I think in that scene where it's Helena alone with Alison's letter, and he says, go on, slap my face, but remember what I told you, I'm going to lay you out. I think the slap comes from a moment of actual self-defense. And I think the kiss, I think there's a couple of options. I think it's continued self-defense in some ways, being like, he might slap me, so I should probably do something that will neutralize that. And it's also in this moment of high adrenaline, high intensity of emotion. I think she probably does have some level of attraction to him, even if that is a sort of twisted, attracted to people who are bad for us thing. It's almost like the slap and the kiss are kind of one thing rather than being two separate actions.
Yeah, it's fascinating you raise the idea that could it have been deliberate? She stays on because she says she's got a job interview. Does she really? I think if we take that at face value, perhaps. But has she, as you say, urged Alison to leave so she could have him? I don't think it's as conscious as that. She said earlier somewhere that she's never seen such hatred in someone's eyes before. It's slightly horrifying and oddly exciting. And then the moment, and it turns, In fact, I think there's a moment of vulnerability on Jimmy's part. He's hugely aggressive, as you just described, and it's physical, but he's also in mourning for his friend's mother's death that he's just witnessed, Allison leaving, the news of the baby. And I think there's a stage direction that suggests that this strong man breaks for a minute and needs some comforting in his anguish. And she responds instinctively to that. But it's also in her, as you, I think, suggested, Dan. I mean, there's an attraction there. She does say somewhere later, I've always wanted you. And she tells Allison that she could hardly believe it herself that she fell for this because perhaps it was only half conscious, this sort of dangerous desire that she's had all along and played a little bit with the fire. But going back to you talking about the contemporary lens, this is also fascinating, and I found quite tricky watching the women's place in this society with these two women and the potent symbol of the ironing board. So again, another coup de théâtre, I guess, Dan, isn't it? That after this occurs, the curtain rises and there's Helena behind the ironing board in exactly the same position that Allison was at the start of the play. And it obviously is a statement of the women's position in this relationship, in the home, in society. How did you go about thinking about the women's position in the play, Atri? And Dan, what do you make of how we feel about that now?
I think to some extent, the thing with Helena and I've always wanted you, always, and I couldn't believe I ended up in this. I think there's an aspect to this which I don't think is entirely literal. Like, I think there's a metaphorical quality to some of this. And I was quite interested in Jimmy at points being a symbol for patriarchy, for toxic masculinity, and how that is a force that repels people, but also a force that really attracts them and really keeps them stuck. Which is why in our production, there's a lift in the center of the stage, which comes up and comes down and is meant to be about dragging people down to hell. It's meant to be about that. So when the ironing board comes back up from the depths of hell, we're suggesting that there's a violence going on even in that image. Again, spoiler for the production, but we've used the imagery of mud and dirt falling towards the end of the show, alluding to Jimmy saying, I want to see your face rubbed in the mud, and Alison saying, I'm in the mud at last. And the ironing board gets buried in the final 15 minutes of the show. So playing with these symbols, I don't think this is a feminist reading of the play. Such descriptions as that can end up being quite reductive of the complexity of what the play is. But I do think it's a production that, because it's amplifying the experience of these women in relationships which are emotionally abusive or coercive, as we've talked about, hopefully it says that we are looking this misogyny in the face rather than covering it up.
Yeah, Dan, I think whatever the psychology is of these relationships, there's also potentially, I suppose, an economic necessity driving the women's choices.
Yes, I think this is a class-conscious play in some ways. Though it is interesting, isn't it, that Jimmy is sort of in some ways very déclassé in the sense that, he's a university graduate, even if it was a white tile university, not a red brick. He works on a sweet stall, which I always find a very strange bit of background. How much money do you make how does he live? That also, he and Cliff, they're sharing an income from it anyway. But, so in some sense, it's very conscious of class resentments and things like that. Certainly the class clash between Alison's family and Jimmy's sense of himself is very clear. But again, because I think this is a play that is partly, it's a sort of psychodrama about what's going on inside people, it's actually interestingly vague about what the reality of the world is outside the room, I think.
Yes, I guess Helena is a working actress. Allison presumably isn't working, but can she survive on her own? The implication, though, is that she would go back to her parents' house if she left and therefore rely on her father. And of course, there's also the idea that Jimmy never seems to end up alone. There's always a woman willing to put up with him and to look after him, to do the ironing. And when Helena says she's leaving, Allison says, but he'll have no one. And Helena says, oh, my dear, he'll find somebody. And I think you believe that's true. I'm conscious of time, and there's still much we could talk about in this play, but I don't want to leave Cliff out. You mentioned Cliff. It's a slightly odd menage a trois, this, isn't it, Atri? Understanding why Cliff is there, why he lives with him, why he stays with him in the middle of this warring relationship. what is going on with him? Why is he there? What is his relationship with Allison, which is surprisingly intimate at times? They behave almost like a couple. He's very kind to her, but he's also physically demonstrative. He puts his arms around her and kisses her quite a lot. There's a strange stage direction that says he puts her fingers in his mouth at one point. And Helena is a bit puzzled by it as well. She asks Allison, what is it with Cliff? What's going on there? What is going on there, Atri?
What is going on with Cliff? Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and I hope this comes across in the production, but we've deliberately kept it quite subtle. I think we tried to understand Cliff as queer in some sense, or like not heteronormative. I don't think that's necessarily conscious to Cliff himself, but I do think there's something about the structure of the trio, which I was thinking about a film like Bertolucci's The Dreamers. There's something about the dynamic which doesn't fit in conventional normative society. And I think Cliff finds some level of safety in that, actually, because I think neither Jimmy nor Allison seem to judge him or treat him any differently. I think Cliff has these moments of like performance of masculinity, and he says these quite macho things which don't necessarily seem to fit in his mouth as much as they might do in Jimmy's. So when he says he's leaving and Jimmy says, you're going to find some nice madam in Pinner or Guildford to look after you, I think they both know that's not what's going to happen. That he's not going to find a woman, because I don't think he's actually attracted to women in that way.
Yeah, he talks at one stage about he could go out and pick up a tart, and you don't believe that either.
You don't believe him at all. There have been versions of this, like I think when Jason Hughes played him at the National, I think it was much more Cliff is in love with Allison, which I think is also a reading you could have. But I think we just wanted to push that maybe a little bit further. Again, thinking about who are the people who exist in our world today, in our society today. Not that it didn't exist in the 50s, but the closeted thing did feel just quite interesting. And Helena calls Jimmy Fay at one point, and then she says Cliff is a bit odd. I don't think Helena's homophobic, but I just think there's a lack of understanding of what that dynamic might be.
I think that's really interesting, because actually I think that also bears a bit on Jimmy, because it's really, really striking. I was very struck actually in your production, the number of times that Jimmy kind of seems to be drawn to queerness to some extent, or to have to defend himself against the charge of it. You know, sometimes it's just through sort of little cast off jokes, the way he compares himself with Webster, the offstage guy who's clearly gay. Or, you know, sometimes he says, I can't remember the exact phrase, but sometimes you want to give up women and become a scoutmaster. And I think that's meant to be a joke about being a queer man. And he defends having long hair, even though that means that people will think he's effeminate or possibly gay, and that Allison's parents hired a detective clearly to see whether he was seeing men. It's really interesting how that depiction of his misogyny is also a depiction of the complexity of his masculinity and the things that he's scared of, drawn to at the same time. That element is a really important part, I think, of Jimmy Porter's personality. And it's interesting, again, just connecting to the autobiography, that John Osborne, in interviews, would sometimes say that he was probably 20% homosexual, and then another interview he'd say he was 30% homosexual, and sometimes he'd say 50%, and you think there's something going on there, even though we only know really about relationships with women. I think John Osborne was someone who is self-exposing enough to be able to represent the complexity of his sexual desires, and you see that, I think, in this play.
That's all great stuff. It's complicated and fascinating for being so. Cliff says at some point, I don't think I have the courage to live on my own. There's some sort of refuge, as you say, Atri, in this place for him. And he's very unhappy when Helena comes in and disturbs that, replaces Allison. It's not the same for him. But that connection, that suggestion with Jimmy, he does say explicitly that he loves them both. And he certainly seems to be drawn to Jimmy's power and energy. He doesn't have that similar energy. You know, there's a counterpoint there. There's a lot of this physical play fighting goes on. And Jimmy reciprocates in the sense that he has a soft spot for Cliff. He says, you're worth half a dozen Helenas to me, and recognizes Cliff for his loyalty. He's got a big heart. I agree with you, Dan. There's some response in him as well, which makes it all the more complicated, moving, Can we go back to the start, in fact, and talk a bit about the question of how relevant this play is, how well it's dated? We talked about the misogyny, so I wondered more about some of the other social and political relevances to our time, the themes that are going on in this play. Atri, I think you've referred in the seminar, for example, to some of the things that we see in our world that have a parallel to the political and social times that were going on then and these characters placed in that world.
I think it's deeply relevant. What struck me about the play was that it was written at a point after great global cataclysm, in a period where there was a lot of nihilism. And I think we find ourselves in a moment of global cataclysm right now, whether that's pandemic, whether that's war, whether that's the climate crisis. And I think young people are very angry today about lots of different things. I know that sounds a bit glib when I put it like that, but I do think the fact of the play being written at a point where hydrogen bomb tests were going on in England itself was a really important detail for me, because both Look Back in Anger and Roots referenced the hydrogen bomb. I think for me, the thing that I found really interesting was the death of empire and the dwindling of empire, which is embodied in Colonel Redfern, for example. And it's why in our production we've cast brilliant South Asian heritage actor Laura Turquia to play Alison, because I was just quite interested in the idea of her being a brown woman, a brown upper class woman. So then how race also becomes another dynamic in Alison and Jimmy's relationship, which I think for me, obviously as a South Asian director myself, just gives it more relevance to the world today too. So yeah, I think it's almost shockingly relevant.
I mean, I recognize the young people, for example, facing the economic challenges, these two living, as you mentioned, Dan, I don't know what he's earning, but not much. And they're living in this one room flat. And, we have the crippling cost of accommodation and housing for young people today. The existential threat's even bigger of climate change, world conflict. There's a generational divide, different values and privilege from the previous generation, which people today can be angry about the privilege that we've enjoyed, previous generation, and what we've done to the planet. And the loss of colonial power, you talked about that, there's something underlying the whole Brexit sentiments that went on, the luster of the imperial past of Britain that we've lost. There's a great quote, actually, Billy Howell, the actor playing Jimmy in your production, says, "What are you not angry about? You ought to be angry in the world in which we live. The injustice of it, there's so much to be angry about."
Sounds a lot like Jimmy Porter there.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, can we just talk briefly about the ending? Earlier, Atri, I think you said something about how you feel there's some hope in it, but it's pretty brutal as well, isn't it, Dan? I mean, Alison comes back. Jimmy learns that she's lost a baby. He's unsympathetic to that, it would seem. On the surface, he seems to revel in her unhappiness. And they end up together, but in a sense of shared anguish and misery. It doesn't seem like the most positive basis for the future together, does it?
Well, no, but I sort of feel the play ends with their relationship at a kind of a rock bottom, but a place from which they think possibly there is a new path forward. There are lots of plays kind of like that. I think of Ibsen's Little Eyolf does a very similar thing where a couple absolutely tear themselves apart, and the very end is kind of like, okay, so what now? I think this is a very tricky ending, because this is the point where the play really challenges us to think, are we really going to endorse the idea that it was a good thing for Alison to have had a miscarriage, because now finally she can feel the same way that Jimmy feels? My feeling is that's Jimmy's view of it, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the play's view of it. And it might be that Alison, you asked before, why does Alison come back to him? Well, as you say, this is all she's known, or she's lost his baby. So at some point she's got to kind of share that with him, and so is drawn back to this situation. That doesn't mean that she's accepting everything he says about it, but nonetheless she has got a flood of feeling, and she knows that that's going to mean something to Jimmy. So I think, I think that reading of it as being hopeful is a really good one. And otherwise, I don't know how to make sense of the play if it isn't a hopeful ending of some kind.
So, Atri, is it hopeful? Is it going to be different for her, that she won't be as subjugated or as abused?
Well, I mean, hope is maybe too strong. The final image of our production is still them getting dragged down together into this pit, like they're digging their own grave.
That doesn't sound like hope, Atri.
No, it doesn't. But I do think it's not hope so much as it's like the Leonard Cohen quote, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I just have to believe that maybe things will be different this time. And obviously we can't relish the fact that she's had a miscarriage, but I also don't think Jimmy does either. Like that particular fact of it, he says, "Oh God, I've lost the child." Then he says, hey, come on. It'll be all right. And he does look after her for the first moment in the play, I think. He consoles her. But as Dan says, it's incredibly tricky. And I imagine it's the kind of ending where 15 different people will have 15 different reactions to it.
One of the things is that they revert to this childlike game playing where they adopt the characters of these animals, the squirrel and the bear, in that language, which fundamentally seems to me a retreat from reality. And it may be the bond they share, and it's their private world, and it's the way they can be together. But one feels you shouldn't need to be like that there's something false about that. It's not the real world or adult, but so be it. We pray for them, though Jimmy wouldn't believe in that. Right. Thank you both very much. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast, I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast, but really that's just a personal favorite. Now, Dan, you've done this several times before and recommended some great ones. Have you got another play that you could recommend for us?
I wanted to pick a contemporary play, and I was thinking about plays of this year, and probably the play that's most excited me this year is Boys on the Verge of Tears by Sam Grabiner, which was done at the Soho Theatre in a wonderful production by James MacDonald. Of course, it was a wonderful production. It's by James MacDonald. It's a playwright's debut and kind of relevant to Look Back in Anger. It is a play about men. It's an entirely male cast, and it's set over 3 days in a men's toilets in a kind of club. We see about 40 characters who are played by 5.5 actors. And we see a huge variety of experiences of masculinity for good and bad. And it's written with incredible empathy and imagination. I think he's got a fantastic ear for dialogue. And it's very funny, it's very brutal, and it's extraordinarily tender and mature. And I think it needs a broader audience. He's a real writer to watch. So that would be my recommendation. Boys on the Verge of Tears by Sam Grabiner.
Great one. As you say, it shows masculinity at various stages of life, as I recall, from how schoolboys are together through adolescence, through every stage of male life. Fabulous choice. Thank you. Atri, what about you?
I mean, great recommendation, Dan. I absolutely loved that play and that production. My answer is a bit more basic in terms of I think it's just my favorite play, which is Faith Healer by Brian Friel. I just think it's meditation on mortality, memory. The way he plays with the slippage of truth and time is just, it blew my socks off. Friel is one of my absolute favorite playwrights. So I'd love to do one of his one day if any artistic directors are listening to this.
Great play.
We have done Faith Healer on the podcast. It's one of my favorites as well. And it aligns with your interest in memory because the way that plays out in that play is fantastic. The language is amazing. It's just beautiful. Great. Well, thank you both so much. This has been a really wonderful conversation. It's a very rich and troubling, but still fascinating play. Atri's production of Look Back in Anger continues at the Almeida Theatre until the 30th of November this year. So please go and see it. As the curtain falls on these bitter emotional battles and we survey all of the wounded, it is easy to be angry at Jimmy's selfish cruelty. His poisonous protest is not only hurtful to those around him, but also ultimately fruitless, and we can't but condemn his misogyny and his apathy. But what the play also shows us is that anger comes from personal pain, the pain of disappointment in oneself, or the anguish of grief, or the lack of love. And blaming others does not lessen that pain. Believing in others and something beyond yourself might. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening, See you next time.